Hello friends, we're here today in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And so there's two things that are going on in this chapter. Two major questions that the Corinthian church had. And the first one has to do with head coverings. And really what it more has to do for us is just this idea of gender roles. So he's talking a lot about something, and to us, we don't know exactly what to do with it, because today in our culture, most women, when they go to church, they don't wear head coverings. And there's something, if you look it up, you can find it. There's something called the head covering movement going on right now, where they're looking at this passage and they're saying, look, it's clear that the Bible is saying that when women pray and when they go to church, they should cover their heads. So why aren't we doing it? Well, there was a lot of major pastors that got on board with this. And so, it's a valid question. And it's actually even a good question, because when we come to issues like, in the previous chapters where we're talking about marriage, we don't want to say, oh, that was cultural back then. That doesn't apply to us. We can't just pick and choose what we want. So when we look at this issue, it's something that we need to look long and hard on and say, is this something that we're just glazing over and we should be doing and we're not? Or is it something that really doesn't apply to our situation? However, I do want to say that in this chapter, as it's talking about gender roles in marriage, it's not asking men to to ask for their wives to submit. It's not like we're supposed to go around saying, submit, woman. That's not honoring either, and I don't think that's not what this passage is talking about. However, it's talking about head coverings, and what the context was for what's going on here is that women were coming in and a lot of them were not covering their heads. And this, if a woman covered their head, it was a symbol that they were married, but it was also a symbol that they were maybe a good girl. If a woman wasn't covering their head, I feel like that was kind of like, it was kind of an issue of, I don't know, edginess. Like when you see young women and they're going to a club or something like that, they wear these certain dresses. They leave modesty at the door, and our culture has a different idea of modesty than what modesty was back then. So having a head cover meant that you were married for sure, but it was also a sign of modesty because the hair is very beautiful. And back then, I think that it was even maybe a little bit sexualized in that culture. So when we look at this, it looks like it's saying, there's a part in the chapter where it says, these women should wear them because it's a sign of authority on their heads. And a lot of people would look at that and say, well, I don't like that at all. I don't like the Bible. I think a lot of people would reject the Bible. A lot of very feminist women would probably reject the Bible just based on this idea. And it's not a good reason to reject the Bible, because submission comes to everyone. There's a part, not in this chapter, but later on in the Bible, where it says, husbands, love your wives, and wives, submit to your husbands. But when it says for husbands to love their wives, it's saying as Christ loved the church, meaning, the husbands are supposed to die for their wives. They're supposed to give up of their entire lives. And it's saying women submit to their husbands. And it's saying it's using Christ as an example, in both of these instances. Christ submits to God the Father, but he submits to God the Father, but he's also the head of the church. So Christ is a picture of submission and love in equal measures here. So in this chapter, it's talking a lot about how a woman should submit to her husband, and I think that he's really speaking to these women that were coming into the church, and I think there were married women that were saying, well, if these women are not wearing their head coverings, why should I wear my head coverings? And it was a valid question. Another part of the puzzle is that sometimes in that culture, when men would go to pagan temples, they would cover their heads of submission to this pagan deity. And so Paul here is saying, men, don't cover your heads because this is not a pagan deity, And women, you should cover your heads, not for the same reason. Now, what does it mean for us today? It might mean that if a woman is coming into a church and she's married, she should look like she's married. She should wear her ring. She shouldn't try to allure other men. I think that it really was an issue when I was a leader in a youth group. There was this issue with these girls wearing, and it sounds silly today, but it was a big problem for the boys. These women were wearing these high school girls were wearing these yoga pants, really tight yoga pants. And then they would talk to the youth pastor about how they're struggling with lust, and it's like, it's not easy. These girls come in and they're looking really good, and so at some point the youth pastor pulled the girls aside and said, you girls, you should really stop wearing these yoga pants. And then the girls were like, well, why do we need to stop wearing yoga pants? What's wrong with this? And some girls ended up leaving, and so it may be a separate issue, but I think it applies here. If women were having their hair uncovered, that was it might have been a little distracting. He goes on in the second part, and he's talking a lot about communion. Now, the issue here is not that they didn't know what communion was, but that what would happen is church would meet, and they didn't have a culture like today where everybody takes off Sunday so that they can go to church. Back then you would come after work, so the richer people, they could come in the middle of the day, and they bring some food. A lot of times in church they would eat together, and so they're having the Lord's Supper together, and they would just eat it all. And by the time the people that made less money, the people that were working later on, the slaves of the culture, once they were able to come in, the food was already eaten. And so it's like they can't partake in the Lord's Supper because it had already been eaten. So what Paul is trying to say is this: the Lord's Supper is not just for you. It's for the community, and it's supposed to be a symbol of your relationship with God. How you're consuming the life of Jesus so that you can live, and you're consuming the death of Jesus so you can live. So they were improperly using communion as a way to, show favoritism in the church. So it's nice that Paul was able to write this part, you know, this correction letter is very useful to us because it highlights things about the communion that we didn't know. Like, we didn't know exactly how the early church did it. You know, some people believe that communion should only be done once a year, and some churches don't do it at all. And it was clear that in the Corinthian church and in the early church, they would do it often. So those are the issues that are coming up here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. So I hope you have a great day. All right, bye.